You think you know how Edgar Allan Poe died. The story is familiar. A tortured genius, a doomed life, an end as dark and dramatic as his own fiction. Drunk in a gutter, destroyed by his own demons. Poetic, even. The kind of death that fits the myth. But here is what the historical record actually shows. On October 3rd, 1849, Poe was found semi-conscious outside a Baltimore tavern, wearing clothes that did not belong to him. He could not explain where he had been for the previous 6 days. He could not explain the clothes. He could not explain most of what had happened to him. He died 4 days later. He was 40 years old. And in 175 years, no one has agreed on why. October 3rd, 1849, Baltimore, Maryland, Election Day. Early October in Baltimore runs cool and gray. The harbor smell sits in the air, salt and coal smoke, and the particular damp of a city built on tidal marsh. Lombard Street is busy by mid-morning. Polling locations draw foot traffic, so do the taverns beside them. Joseph Walker is a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, a man who sets type for a living, which means he works early and moves through the city on foot with the particular alertness of someone accustomed to reading things closely. He is passing along East Lombard Street when he sees a figure near the entrance of a place called Gunner's Hall. The man is propped rather than sitting, his body folded against the building in a way that suggests he did not choose the position so much as arrive in it. His clothes are wrong, coarse fabric, ill-fitting at the shoulders, the kind of clothes worn by a man several sizes different from the one wearing them. His face is pale and unshaven. His eyes, when they open, do not focus. When he speaks, what comes out is not language. Walker stops. He looks more carefully. The man is in his early 40s, dark hair, a face Walker knows, or thinks he knows, from somewhere he can't immediately place. Then he places it. He sends word to Dr. Joseph Evans Snodgrass, a physician who knows the man personally. The man is Edgar Allan Poe. Snodgrass arrives and arranges for Poe to be transferred to Washington College Hospital, where he is placed under the care of the attending physician, Dr. John Joseph Moran. Over the following hours, Poe drifts in and out of consciousness. He is never lucid enough to explain where he has been or what has happened to him. At some point during those 4 days, he begins repeating a name or a word. The accounts differ on exactly how it was spoken, but they agree on what it was. Reynolds. No one present could identify who or what Reynolds referred to. No one since has established it with certainty. He died on October 7th, 1849, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Poe had left Richmond, Virginia on September 27th, 1849. His destination was Philadelphia and then New York. Baltimore was a connection stop, a matter of hours, not days. He had been in reasonable condition when he left. Acquaintances in Richmond described him as sober and relatively well. He was engaged to be married to a widow named Elmira Royster Shelton. He had plans. He had work. Somewhere in Baltimore, those 6 days disappeared. No hotel in the city recorded his name. No acquaintance in Baltimore reported seeing him. His personal trunk, containing his clothing, his papers, his belongings, was found at the train depot, unclaimed. He had never picked it up. For nearly a week, one of the most recognizable literary figures in America produced no record of his existence. No letter, no receipt, no sighting, nothing. When he surfaced on October 3rd, he was wearing someone else's clothes. Poe's contemporaries described him as careful about his appearance, even in poverty. He was not a man who dressed carelessly. The clothes found on him, coarse, poorly fitted, not his style. were inconsistent with everything documented about him. His own clothing was in the trunk he never retrieved. 3 explanations present themselves, and none of them close the question. The first, robbery. He was attacked, stripped, and redressed. This would account for the clothing and the condition, but no one reported a robbery. No injuries were formally documented at the time, and it does not explain the 6-day disappearance. The second, voluntary exchange. He traded or sold his clothes for some reason. This requires him to have been in a state of severe impairment or crisis from the moment he arrived. Possible, given his history, but undocumented. The third explanation has a name: cooping. That word is worth pausing on. It will matter. The hospital records would eventually clarify what happened to him. Except the hospital records do not exist. Washington College Hospital's records from Poe's admission are gone. They do not survive in any archive. The cause of death on the commonly cited death certificate is congestion of the brain, a phrase so vague it describes nearly any neurological event. And that document is itself a reconstruction, not a contemporary original. The evidentiary foundation for what happened inside that hospital rests almost entirely on one man, Dr. John Joseph Moran. Moran was the attending physician. He was present. He should be the most reliable source available. He is also the most problematic. In the days immediately after Poe's death, Moran wrote a letter describing what he had witnessed. That letter is restrained, clinical, brief. It offers some observations about Poe's condition and little else. 11 years later, in 1860, Moran published an account of the final days. New details had appeared: extended dialogue, emotional color, specific observations that required Moran to have seen or heard things he had not recorded in 1849. By 1885, Moran had published a full book, A Defense of Edgar Allan Poe. The scenes had become fully dramatized. Final words were rendered in direct quotation: "Lord, help my poor soul." Those words do not appear in the 1849 letter. They do not appear in the 1860 account in the same form. They arrive, fully formed, 36 years after the death. Historians have not generally accused Moran of deliberate fabrication. Memory corrupts, myth intrudes. A man who attended a famous death, retelling it over decades as the subject grew into legend. The story grows with the telling. This is how it happens. But the result is that the only primary witness to Edgar Allan Poe's final days produced a record that contradicts itself across 4 decades. 8 serious explanations have been advanced for Poe's death. Each has something to recommend it. None is complete. Alcohol poisoning is the oldest and most persistent. Poe had a documented and severe history with alcohol. Dr. Snodgrass, who saw him at Gunner's Hall, later described him as appearing intoxicated. But Moran explicitly denied alcohol was a factor and described symptoms that don't align cleanly with acute intoxication. Rabies is the most surprising entry. In 1996, Dr. R. Michael Benitez, a cardiologist at the University of Maryland Medical Center, published a retrospective analysis in the Maryland Medical Journal, arguing that Poe's documented symptoms, fluctuating consciousness, hydrophobia, agitation, tremors, match the presentation of encephalitic rabies more closely than any other condition. The diagnosis was taken seriously in the medical community. The counterpoint is unavoidable. The diagnosis was made from second-hand accounts written 147 years after the fact. No bite was ever documented. A brain lesion or tumor has been proposed on the basis of the neurological presentation. The surviving records do not support or refute it. Tuberculosis, which Poe did have, is unlikely to explain the acute presentation. A beating has been suggested, consistent with the disorientation, consistent with the clothing, but no injuries were formally recorded, and the records that might have contained that information are gone. Carbon monoxide poisoning and hypoglycemia are modern, retroactive hypotheses, with no contemporaneous support at all. None of these explanations eliminates the others. Several could coexist. Poe could have been ill, impaired, and then subjected to violence. He could have had a neurological event that made him vulnerable to whatever came next. The theories do not converge. One theory, however, aligns with the physical evidence in a way the others do not. It also has no direct proof whatsoever. October 3rd, 1849, was Election Day in Baltimore. Not a national election, a municipal and congressional vote, ward level, the kind that produced intense local competition and, in certain wards, organized violence. The practice was called cooping. Gangs operating on behalf of political factions, in Baltimore often connected to machine politics, would seize individuals off the streets, drifters, strangers, men passing through who had no one to report them missing. Targets were taken to a secure location, referred to as a coop. They were forced to vote repeatedly at different polling stations throughout the day, moved between locations between rounds, and redressed in different clothing so poll workers wouldn't recognize them from the last stop. To maintain compliance and suppress resistance, victims were given alcohol, sometimes other substances. The goal was a man who would move when told to move and not cause trouble. A man confused enough to follow instructions, coherent enough to perform the act of voting, and impaired enough not to remember it later. The practice was documented. Political reformers in Baltimore named it explicitly in campaign literature and post-election complaints. Newspaper accounts from the period describe it. Testimony before reform committees in the early 1850s references it directly. It was not a secret in the city's political culture. It was a known mechanism, an expected cost of doing certain kinds of electoral business. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is found on October 3rd, 1849, at Gunners Hall on East Lombard Street. Gunners Hall is an active polling location that day. He is wearing clothes that are not his. He is incoherent and cannot account for where he has been. His condition is consistent with prolonged forced intoxication. The alignment is exact. The proof is absent. No witness placed Poe in the custody of a cooping gang. No gang member ever named him. No account from the period connects him directly to the operation. The most coherent explanation for what happened to Edgar Allan Poe cannot be confirmed by a single piece of direct evidence. Return to Moran. His 1849 letter describes a patient in crisis. It says little about what was said or done in the room. It does not attempt to be a complete account. It was written in the immediate aftermath, when the death was recent, and its significance unclear, before Poe's reputation had fully calcified into legend. His 1860 publication introduces detail that was absent from the letter: the quality of Poe's distress, fragments of speech, observations about his mental state that would require Moran to have been recording rather than treating. 11 years is long enough for memory to absorb the shape of a story it has told many times. Each retelling smooths certain edges and sharpens others. By 1885, the account has a texture the 1849 letter doesn't approach. Lord help my poor soul. A dying man's final reckoning, preserved in direct quotation, published when Poe had been dead for more than 3 decades, and Moran was the last surviving figure with a claim on what the room contained. Consider the structure of that position. Moran attended a man who would become one of the most discussed literary figures of the century. He was the only physician present. Every time someone wanted to know what happened in those final hours, they came to Moran. Over 36 years, the story he told was the story that survived. There was no competing account. There was no one to contradict him. The room he described was, in a real sense, his to describe however memory, or myth, directed. It changed each time he told it. This does not make Moran a fraud. It makes him a human being who was present at something that grew, in retrospect, much larger than the moment itself. But it means the record we have is not a record. It is a reconstruction shaped by 36 years of retelling, myth-making, and the slow pressure of a dead man's growing reputation. The mystery of Poe's death did not survive because no one investigated it. It survived because the only witness could not keep his account stable. Here is what the historical record confirms. On October 3, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found delirious at a Baltimore polling location, wearing clothes that were not his, with no ability to account for the previous 6 days. He repeated a word or name, Reynolds, that no one present could identify. He died 4 days later. The hospital records are gone. The death certificate that survives is a reconstruction. The newspaper accounts from the time disagree on cause of death. Some print congestion of the brain. At least one uses the word cooping without elaboration. The only physician who treated him left 4 substantially different accounts of what he witnessed, the most detailed of which appeared 36 years after the fact. The clothing was never explained. Reynolds was never identified. Picture the hospital room on East Baltimore Street in the early hours of October 7, 1849. A man in his 40s, intermittently conscious, intermittently agitated. Whatever he knew about the previous 6 days, he either could not access it or could not communicate it. He died without explaining himself. The case file closes empty. Edgar Allan Poe invented the modern detective story. He created a character, C. Auguste Dupin, whose method was to reason backward from evidence to cause, to find the hidden logic underneath apparent chaos. He wrote fiction premised on the idea that everything, examined carefully enough, reveals its structure. He did not get that ending. The man who invented the detective story left behind a case that has defeated every method he invented. Not because the mystery is too complex, because the evidence was never there to begin with, and what little existed was lost, altered, or contradicted before anyone thought to preserve it. Poe's death turns on what disappeared: records, time, memory. But some moments in history don't disappear. They fracture. They become a before and an after. And the distance between the two is the entire shape of the modern world. Next on Lore&Ruin. In June 1914, a motorcade took a wrong turn on a street in Sarajevo. The driver corrected it, reversed, began to pull away. But the correction put the car directly in front of a man who had already given up for the day and was standing at a delicatessen eating a sandwich. What happened in the next 90 seconds didn't just kill an archduke. It activated a system of alliances, obligations, and military timetables that had been building for decades. A machine that needed only one wrong turn to start. One wrong turn. A driver who corrected his mistake, and 20 million people who never came home. Subscribe, and you'll be there when it drops.